The first time anyone saw what Martha was doing, it was early March, when the creek was still running high and cold with the last of the winter melt. Mr. Abramson, whose land abutted hers to the north, was riding his fence line, checking for posts the frost might have heaved. He stopped his horse where the creek made a long, slow bend, marking the edge of her lower pasture. He saw her standing thigh-deep in the grey water, her heavy wool skirt soaked and clinging to her legs. Her German shepherd, Scout, sat patient and watchful on the muddy bank, his head cocked. In her hands, she held a bundle of bare, flexible switches, no thicker than a man's thumb. One by one, she was forcing them deep into the soft earth of the creek bed, just at the water's edge, tamping them firm with the heel of her boot. She worked with a slow, methodical rhythm that paid no mind to the cold or the current pulling at her. Abramson watched for a full minute before he called out, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the water. "Planting a garden in the creek, Martha." He didn't mean it unkindly. It was just a sight so peculiar it demanded a comment. She looked up, squinting against the flat, white light of the sky, but didn't stop her work. She just pushed another willow whip into the muck. "Just planting," she said. Her voice was calm, not offering any more than the facts. "For shade, I suppose," Abramson mused, more to his horse than to her. A sight of work for a bit of shade, she gave a small, non-committal nod and turned her attention back to the bundle of switches in her arm. He watched her for another moment, a lone woman in a wide, empty landscape, engaged in a task that made no practical sense. He shook his head, a small smile touching his lips, and nudged his horse onward. The story made its way around the sparse community over the next few weeks, a piece of harmless gossip. The widow was planting switches in the creek. A woman's fancy. A way to pass the time, maybe. It's a quiet story, the kind that unfolds slowly over seasons instead of days, but these are often the ones that have the most to teach. If you appreciate these kinds of lessons from the past, the ones rooted in patience and observation, you might consider sticking with us for a while. Martha had been on that land for 15 years, the last 2 of them alone. Her husband, Jebediah, had been a quiet man, and in his absence, the silence in the small ranch house seemed to have settled into her very bones. After he was gone, the men in the valley, Abramson and Hayes and the others, had expected her to sell. It was a hard life for a man, let alone a woman on her own with nothing but a dog for company. But the thought never crossed her mind. This land wasn't just a plot of dirt and grass, it was a living thing she had come to know as well as she knew the back of her own hand. She knew the way the wind came down from the high peaks in winter, and where the snowdrifts would pile deepest. She knew which patches of ground held the morning frost the longest. And she knew the creek. She'd spent years observing it, not as a boundary line or a water source, but as a force. She saw how it nibbled at the banks during the spring thaw, carrying away a little more of her best pasture each year. It was a slow theft, a few inches here, a foot there, the kind of loss most people wouldn't notice until a fence post finally toppled in. But Martha noticed. She saw the fine cracks appearing in the dry earth 10 feet back from the edge, a sign that the foundation beneath was being hollowed out. She walked the creek line every evening, Scout trotting silently at her heel, his presence a warm, solid comfort. He never strayed far, his gaze constantly moving from the horizon to her face, as if gauging her thoughts by the set of her jaw. She didn't talk to him, not in the way some people talk to their animals, but there was an understanding between them that ran deeper than words. He was her shadow, her witness. When the idea first took root in her mind, it felt less like a decision and more like a memory surfacing. It was Jebediah's memory, his quiet wisdom, and it was as sturdy and practical as everything else about him. The work was hers to do, but the knowledge came from him. It had been 5 years ago, during a dry spell. The creek was low, exposing the bones of the earth, the layers of stone and soil. She and Jebediah had been walking the very same bend where Abramson would later see her. He rarely spoke unless he had something essential to say. He'd stopped and pointed with a worn walking stick at a single, scraggly wild willow that had somehow taken root right at the water's edge. All around it, the bank was a miniature cliff of raw, crumbling dirt. But in the small circle of the willow's influence, the bank was solid, held together by a web of fine, pale roots that were visible in the low water. "See that?" he'd said. It was the beginning of his rare lessons. He didn't lecture, he just pointed out what was already there. The water's a thief. It steals the land. Piece by piece he poked at the tangled mass of roots with his stick. They were dense, like a tightly woven basket. "But the willow," he continued, his voice low and gravelly, "the willow is the law. It holds what belongs to the land." He explained it in his simple, direct way. He said most trees sent a big root straight down, looking for water deep in the earth. They were selfish, anchoring only themselves. But the willow was different. It was generous. It sent its roots out, not just down, spreading 1,000 tiny fingers through the topsoil, stitching it together. "It builds a net," he'd told her. "A living net. And it doesn't ask for much. Just a wet place to stand and to be left alone." He'd cut a switch from the wild tree with his pocket knife, trimmed the leaves, and pushed it into the mud a few feet away. "You give it a start," he said, tamping the earth around it with his boot. "And it does the rest of the work itself." She had stored the memory away, a piece of his quiet, practical knowledge. Now, with him gone and the creek's thievery growing more apparent each season, the memory had returned not as a piece of sentiment, but as a clear set of instructions. It was a duty he had left her, a final, unspoken lesson in how to care for the place they had built together. The principle was simple, as most profound things are. The willow is a pioneer. It thrives in disturbed, wet soil where other, fussier trees would fail. Its power lies not in its size or its strength, but in its tenacity and the design of its root system. Unlike the sturdy oak or the towering pine, which rely on a deep, central taproot to anchor them against the wind, the willow invests its energy in a shallow, fibrous mat of roots that can spread 20 or 30 feet from the trunk in every direction. This root mat is incredibly dense, a thick weave of living fibers that insinuates itself into the soil, binding the individual grains of silt, sand, and clay into a single, cohesive mass. It doesn't just hold the soil, it becomes one with it. When floodwaters rise and the current begins to scour the land, it meets this reinforced barrier. The water can't get a purchase. It can't peel away the layers of topsoil because the willow's net is holding them fast. The branches of the tree play their part as well. They are famously flexible, designed to bend without breaking. In a flood, a line of willows acts like a comb. The trees don't try to stop the water, an impossible task, but rather to slow it down. As the raging current flows through the dense stand of trunks and branches, its velocity is checked. The friction creates eddies and slows the flow, causing the water to drop its sediment load. Over time, this process not only prevents erosion but actively builds the land, trapping the silt that would have been washed downstream and depositing it along the bank, making it higher and stronger with each passing high-water event. Martha understood this not in the language of a scientist, but in the practical terms Jebediah had used. It was a living wall, but a wall that yielded, that worked with the water instead of fighting it. It was a lesson in patience. She wasn't building a dam of stone and timber that could be washed out in a single, violent surge. She was planting an idea, an army of patient, living anchors that would only grow stronger and more effective with every passing year. The first year was a trial of faith. She had planted over 200 willow whips along the half-mile bend of the creek that bordered the pasture. She'd harvested them from the wild stands upriver, bundling them and hauling them back 24 at a time. The planting itself, in the cold water of March, was brutal work. But the real test came that summer. It was a dry one. The rains that usually came in June and July never materialized. The creek shrank, pulling away from the banks where she had planted the whips. The mud around them baked and cracked in the relentless sun. Twice a week, every week, from June until September, Martha hauled water. She would walk into the deepest part of the channel with 2 large wooden buckets, fill them, and then trudge back to the bank, her boots sinking in the mud. She'd give each struggling whip a dipperful of water, a small offering against the vast, thirsty sky. Scout would lie in the sliver of shade cast by a cut bank, watching her, his tongue lolling in the heat. He'd get up and follow her on each trip to the water, a silent, 4-legged partner in the grueling labor. By August, nearly a third of the whips were dead, their stems brittle and brown. Another third were barely clinging to life, with just a few pale, yellowing leaves. Only the hardiest, the ones planted in the lowest spots that held the moisture longest, seemed to be thriving. Mr. Hayes, whose ranch was downstream from hers, rode by one afternoon and saw her at her task. He was a good man, but a blunt one. "You're going to wear yourself to a nub for a patch of sticks, Martha," he said, reining in his horse. "There's easier ways to get shade." She just nodded, wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of a muddy hand, and picked up her buckets for another trip. She didn't have the words, or the inclination, to explain that she wasn't planting for shade. She was planting for the future, a concept that was hard to see under the glare of that unforgiving summer sun. The work was a promise she was keeping to Jebediah, and to the land itself. The second year, the rains returned, and the surviving willows began to grow in earnest. They were no longer just sticks, but small, bushy saplings, some of them already taller than she was. A new problem arose with their success. A family of beavers moved into the creek, drawn by the tender, accessible bark of the young trees. One morning, she came down to the pasture to find a dozen of her most promising saplings felled, their trunks sharpened to a point like a pencil, dragged away to reinforce the beaver's dam downstream. It was a sickening sight, a year of hard work undone in a single night. For a week, she was at a loss. But Martha was not a woman who surrendered easily. She spent 3 days scavenging for old wire, pulling it from a collapsed section of fence on the far side of her property. She cut the wire into lengths and, with painstaking effort, wrapped the base of every single remaining willow tree. It was tedious, finger-cramping work, but it was necessary. The beavers, thwarted, eventually moved on. The third year, it was grasshoppers. A great, buzzing cloud of them descended on the valley in late summer, chewing through hayfields and vegetable gardens with voracious efficiency. They swarmed her willows, stripping the leaves from the branches until they were skeletal and bare. The trees looked dead, and for a while, she feared the plague had finished what the drought and the beavers had started. That autumn, Abramson and Hayes were mending the stretch of fence they shared, not far from the creek. They could see Martha's switch patch, as they had come to call it. Still at it, Hayes observed, shaking his head as he strained a wire. "A woman's fancy, I suppose." "My wife plants roses," Abramson grunted in agreement, hammering a staple into a post. "Seems a lot of work for something the bugs'll just eat," he said. "Have to admire her persistence, though. She's stubborn as a mule." They watched her for a moment as she moved among the leafless trees, clearing away weeds from their bases. She looked small and solitary against the vastness of the landscape, and the task she had set for herself seemed, to their practical eyes, both pointless and unending. But the willows, like Martha, were stubborn. The following spring, the fourth since she had begun her work, new buds appeared on the branches that had been stripped bare by the grasshoppers. They leafed out, thicker and more vigorous than before. The trees that had survived the drought, the beavers, and the insects had been tested and hardened. They were no longer fragile saplings. Their trunks were thickening, their bark was growing rough, and their roots, unseen beneath the earth, were knitting the soil together, just as Jebediah had said they would. Time passed. The fifth year, the willows were well established, a dense, green wall of life lining the creek bend. The sixth year, they were proper trees, 15 feet high, their branches arching out over the water. The changes to the creek bank were no longer subtle. The constant, slow carving of the earth had stopped completely. The water, even after a heavy summer rain, seemed to run clearer along her stretch of the creek, the willows acting as a filter. Songbirds, which had been scarce in the open pasture, began to build their nests in the thick, protected canopy of the branches. The air there felt different, cooler, and more alive. The creek was no longer just a boundary, it was a sanctuary. Martha would walk the line in the evenings, Scout at her side, and feel a deep, quiet satisfaction. She had not conquered the creek. She had made a partnership with it. She had given it the tools to heal itself, to hold onto its own edges. She would run her hand over the rough bark of a tree that had once been a simple switch she'd pushed into the mud with her own 2 hands. It was a testament to the power of a single, persistent idea. Others still saw it as a pleasant, shady spot, a welcome break in the long, sun-bleached expanse of pastureland. They saw the beauty of the trees, but they did not understand their purpose. They saw the effect, but they had forgotten, or never known, the cause. Martha didn't mind. The willows weren't there for them. They were there for the land. The 7th winter was a hard one. The snow came early and stayed late, piling in great drifts against the sides of the barns and fences. The old-timers in the valley said they hadn't seen a snowpack like it in the high country for 30 years. It was a beautiful and menacing sight, a vast reservoir of frozen water waiting for the spring. Martha spent the winter months making sure her livestock were secure, her firewood stacked high. She felt a low, persistent hum of apprehension, a feeling she had learned to trust. Scout seemed to feel it too. He was restless, often pacing by the door and whining softly, his ears twitching at the sound of the wind. When the thaw finally came in late April, it came not as a gentle melt but as a sudden, violent release. A week of unseasonably warm weather was followed by 3 straight days of heavy, drenching rain. It was the worst possible combination. The warm rain fell on the deep snowpack, dissolving it, turning the entire watershed into a funnel. The creeks and streams that were usually placid tributaries swelled into muddy, churning torrents overnight. On the 2nd day of the rain, Martha stood on her porch and listened. Beneath the steady drumming of the rain on her roof, she could hear a new sound, a deep, grinding roar from the direction of the creek. It was the sound of rocks and boulders being rolled along the bottom, a sound of immense and terrifying power. The coyotes, usually silent during the day, could be heard yipping and howling from the high ridges, a sign they had moved to safer ground. The birds were gone, the sky was empty of everything but the grey, falling water. The creek, which normally ran 30 feet wide, had become a raging brown river 100 yards across, spilling out over the low-lying pastures. It was a force of nature unleashed, a power that could erase years of work in a matter of hours. Martha called Scout inside, bolted the door, and waited. There was nothing more she could do. The work had been done years before. Now, it was up to the willows. The flood peaked sometime in the dead of night. The roar was a constant, physical presence that vibrated through the floorboards of the house. By morning, the rain had stopped, and a weak, watery sun was breaking through the clouds. The world was awash in a sea of brown water. Martha walked to the edge of the rise where her house stood, Scout close by her side, and looked down at the devastation. The valley was transformed. Upstream, on Mr. Abramson's land, the creek had carved a new, raw channel. A huge, crescent-shaped bite had been taken out of his best hayfield. Where there had once been 20 yards of rich pasture, there was now a sheer, crumbling cliff of mud and exposed rock. The fence was gone, and the entire field was buried under a thick layer of sterile sand and gravel. The water had scoured his land down to the bone. Then her eyes followed the creek to her own property line. The change was immediate and stark. As the floodwater hit the line of willows, its character changed. The trees, half submerged, stood against the torrent, their flexible trunks and branches bending but not breaking. They acted as a break, a porous dam that absorbed the water's fury. The current, forced to navigate the dense forest of trunks, slowed dramatically. The water that flowed past the willows and onto her pasture was wide and deep, but it was no longer a destructive force. It was a slow-moving lake. It deposited a fine, rich layer of dark silt over the grass, but it did not tear the earth away. When she looked at her bank, it was still there. Muddy, littered with debris, but solid. Intact. The willows had held. They had done the work they were planted for. Later that day, as the water began to recede, Abramson rode over. He didn't ride to her house, but to the new, raw cliff that marked the edge of his ruined field. He sat on his horse for a long time, just looking at the line where his scoured land met her untouched bank. He saw the willows, their leaves caked with mud, standing firm. Martha watched him from a distance. He finally turned his horse and saw her standing there. He didn't say anything about his loss. He just looked at her willows, then back at his own devastated pasture. He lifted his chin in a slow, tired nod. "The willows," he said, his voice rough with a new understanding. It was all that needed to be said. The following spring, a new activity began along the creek beds of the valley. It started with Abramson. Martha saw him from a distance, down by his ravaged creek bank, not with a plow or a team of horses, but with a bundle of willow switches. He was working alone, pushing them into the soft mud at the base of the new cliff, just as he had seen her do years before. He didn't ask her for advice. He didn't come to her to acknowledge that she had been right. The proof was in the land itself, a lesson carved by the flood. His quiet, solitary labor was acknowledgement enough. A few weeks later, she saw Mr. Hayes doing the same thing on his stretch of the creek downstream. The two men, practical and grounded, had seen the evidence with their own eyes. They had witnessed how a small, patient act could stand against a great and violent force. The idea spread without a word being spoken, a piece of communal wisdom passed not through conversation, but through observation and imitation. The widow's folly had become the valley's new common sense. Martha continued her evening walks along her stretch of the creek with Scout. The willows were now a mature grove, a thriving ecosystem that had fundamentally changed the character of her land. They had saved her pasture, but they had given her something more. They were a living monument to her persistence, to the quiet wisdom passed down from her husband. They stood as proof that the most effective solutions are not always the biggest or the fastest. Sometimes, the best way to hold your ground is to plant something that knows how to bend. It was a lesson the whole valley was slowly, quietly learning. Jebediah had told her once, looking out over the fields, that some problems are too big to fight head-on. You don't build a wall against the water, he had said, his voice a low rumble. You teach the land to hold itself. It was that kind of thinking, that long-term patience, that feels like it's from another time. But maybe it's what we need most right now. Let us know what you think in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.